Welcome back to AP US History. This is part 2 in chapter 15. We'll be looking at things that led to the Civil War. In 1850, it looked like we might go to civil war over a variety of issues. The slavery issue just seems to be heating up, and there doesn't seem to be enough middle ground, no compromise, each side pointing the finger at the other, a wedge being driven between the North and the South. Now, the Compromise of 1850, there were some issues that were facing the Union in terms of the eyes of the Southerners. They felt that if California came in, it would tip the balance in the Senate, and the slave states would be outnumbered by the northern states. They were also upset over other things. They seemed to think that New Mexican and Utah territories would lean towards a free state status, in which they did. Texas claimed some other areas outside of the border into New Mexico, and they threatened to seize it, and so that'll have to be worked out. Northerners were demanding that abolition of slavery in D.C. Seemed a little tacky to have slaves in the capital. Southerners were peeved about the loss of fugitive slaves, and they wanted something done about that. The fire eaters, these are the folks down in the South, particularly South Carolina, said that if California came in and the balance of power were tipped in favor of the North, that they were going to secede from the Union. Now here shows the territories, the free, the slave, and the territory open to slavery by the principle of popular sovereignty. And that would be Utah and New Mexico territory. Background events during this time: Henry Clay, who really doesn't have a dog in the fight, but he wants to save the Union. He wants to find some kind of middle ground so that the North and the South can live in peace. So he's going to try to seek a compromise, meet both sides in the middle. He believed that the North should have a more effective fugitive slave law to placate the South. Stephen Douglas, who is a prominent Democrat, Northern Democrat, believes that popular sovereignty probably is the best way to settle the issue of slavery in the West. John C. Calhoun rejected most of Clay's positions. He believed in the return of all runaway slaves and restore the balance in the Senate and leave the institution of slavery alone. Daniel Webster supported Clay because he was a strong Union man. He felt that he should do whatever he could to preserve the Union. And so he felt that a reasonable concession to the South on a tougher fugitive slave law would be in order. He opposed Congress legislating against slavery in the new territory because it really was a moot point, because they couldn't grow cotton there and probably would never bring slaves or the plantation system to this area. He was instrumental in turning the tide in the North, convincing other people to sign on to this compromise. The abolitionists certainly felt that Webster was a turncoat, that he a traitor to their cause. Now, Webster despised abolitionists because he believed that they were going to destroy the nation, and rightly so. Here shows Daniel Webster worked at all costs to save the Union. There was a man named William H. Seward, who was an abolitionist, who strongly opposed, and he convinced other people that slavery certainly was an abomination and it should be eliminated from the United States. He believed in a higher moral law, higher than the Constitution. Now, the threat of war seemed imminent. President Taylor, who had been elected, seemed to be swayed by Seward argument about the slavery issue, even though he was a Southerner. And he's not really willing to make too many concessions to the South, even though he's a Southerner himself. Fortunately or unfortunately, he is going to die of cholera, and his successor is going to sign the Compromise of 1850. This is Fillmore is going to become the president, and he's going to sign the bill into law. Stephen Douglas certainly worked tireless to get this bill through, trying to find some middle ground for the North and the South. Now, in terms of the compromise, there were several parts. One, California would be admitted as a free state. They decided that the abolition of slave trade would be abolished, but not slavery. Popular sovereignty would apply to the Mexican cession, this being the Utah and the New Mexico territories. And they came up with a more stringent fugitive slave law to help return slaves to the right owners in the South. Here shows Stephen Douglas supporting the compromise. Texas would receive $10 million for their claims in the New Mexico territory because they're going to trim the border back. A memory aid that might help you is popular or Pop Fact, and here how it works: popular sovereignty in New Mexican territory, fugitive slave law, tougher fugitive slave law, abolition of the slave trade in the Washington, D.C. area, and California being admitted as a free state, and Texas given $10 million for the disputed territory in New Mexico. The results of the compromise, certainly most feel that the North got a better deal. California tipped the Senate in the favor of the Northerners. They're going to have one more state than the Southerners in terms of the slavery issue. Popular sovereignty in New Mexico, well, it really wasn't suited for cotton. Probably there would never be any slaves there. The halt of the slave trade in Washington, D.C., well, a minor victory for the North. What the Southerners had hoped that they would receive was a tougher fugitive slave law in which they could return slaves to the rightful owners. But this was never enforced by the North. The North felt it was so hideous that many states would not enforce the law. The abolitionist movement grew because the North was appalled at the new slave law. Slaves could not testify on their own behalf and were denied jury trials. An accusation was enough, even if you were a free black. Heavy fines and jail sentences were handed out to those people who helped slaves get away through the Underground Railroad. Massachusetts just flat out refused to enforce the law, and they applied the nullification principle, which has been tried before. In Ableman versus Booth in 1859, the Supreme Court upheld the fugitive slave law and said it was constitutional. Probably the most important result of this compromise is it delays the Civil War for 10 years. So blood will not be shed for another 10 years. In terms of the compromise itself, it probably helped the North in several ways. One, in 10 years, the economy had grown, industry had grown, more railroads existed. The North was much better equipped to fight the Civil War. In 1850, probably you didn't have that many Northerners who were willing to fight the South. But in 1860, they were convinced that maybe that was a just cause to save the Union. Controversy in 1850 convinced Northerners to resist secession, preserve the Union. Now, Franklin Pierce is going to become president in the election of 1852, and he's a friend of the South. And this will end the Whig Party. He's a Democrat. The Whigs will just sort of fade into the sunset, and the Free Soilers will become a little more prominent. And so this is seen as a victory for the South in terms of the slave issue, and shows the candidates that ran in the 1852 election. This was the results, and you can see that Franklin Pierce was an overwhelming victor in terms of the electoral votes. Pierce sought to extend Manifest Destiny overseas. During his presidency, they acquired the Gadsden Purchase from Mexico to help build a transcontinental railway in the South. That seemed to be the best route. Southerners support the idea of acquiring Cuba to expand slavery, but this never takes place. American expansion overseas will be realized after the Spanish-American War in 1898. Now, one act that's really going to stick in the craw of the Northerners is the Kansas-Nebraska Act passed in 1854. This is the last act that seems to make any kind of compromise on either side. Stephen Douglas was in support of building a railroad from Illinois to California. He wanted to build it through what was the old Louisiana Territory, Nebraska, Kansas Territory. In order to do that, he had to get the land surveyed so the railroad could build the tracks across this area. He said that if the slavery issue did come up, it would be decided by popular sovereignty. He brokered a deal with the Southerners in saying, well, Kansas could become a slave state and Nebraska would become a free state. Seemed like a reasonable compromise. But if we look back in the Compromise of 1820, it said that there wouldn't be any slaves above 3630, and the Northerners are going to feel like they've been betrayed because of this act that's going to be passed in 1854. And you can see here Kansas Territory clearly above the 3630 latitude line. The Southerners really liked the act. They said, well, you know, this looks like we're going to get another slave state or two. The Northerners were shocked that somehow they had broken this sacred promise made with the Missouri Compromise. Because the bill was passed, it wrecked the compromises of 1820 and 1850. Both sides will be unwilling to compromise in the future. The Republican Party will be created in response to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and this is going to be the birth of the party. And there's going to be a whole coalition of people that come under the umbrella of the Republican Party. And we'll stop right there, and we'll pick this up next time.